Let's talk a bit about the move from being like a data scientist and an operator to an investor. It's not an obvious move, right? I wonder what you liked about it, what you didn't anticipate about it, what is more challenging about it.
So for some context, I started my career in the defense and intelligence sector, initially working on computational models of insurgencies, most specifically Somali pirate groups, subsequently moved into more data mining focused position where I was deployed to the Secret Service. Then, of course, did a stint at Palantir. But most recently, I'd led the data and ML team at a company called Mattermark, where we were collecting data on other startups and selling it to investors. So it was through that role that I ended up transitioning into venture. So I share that because when I talk to other people who are making the transition from data science into venture, I think I typically see like three different paths. One of those paths is to actually do kind of like data science driven investing to kind of leverage either the digital exhaust that exists in the world or the private data to which investors sometimes have access to make investment decisions or at least to kind of like source deals. The other path is to work kind of as a data scientist or analyst in residence, where you're providing portfolio support, helping companies with their reporting, helping them implement machine learning projects and things like that. And then, the third path is to really just focus on investing, including in data and ML tools and platforms. When I first transitioned into investing, I was at another firm called Canvas Ventures. And I'd say that I actually fit kind of the first archetype more. I was very focused on thinking about how to use data to inform investing. And frankly, I've become increasingly skeptical of that approach over time for two primary reasons. I think, particularly at the early stages, the data that exists on startups, it's so sparse, it's so noisy that frankly, like I'm not convinced that you can draw any meaningful conclusions from it. Or at the very least, those conclusions will be like low to moderate confidence. Similarly, I think one of the things that I found is that like the venture capital industry, it relies so heavily on networks and kind of interpersonal connections. And like, I just don't think you can wean VCs off networking. Perhaps there are ways for like data to be a complement to networks at the later stages. But if I'm being very blunt, like I think like data-driven investing was not for me.
What do you look for in founders and in startups?
My typical tagline is like people, product, market. And I think that kind of reflects why I'm skeptical about the role that data can play in early stage investing. It is both challenging to collect and also challenging to rely upon any data about people. I think people tend to expose themselves in a way that is not easily captured through digital exhaust. So I think typically like what we're looking for are people who have a clear vision of what the world could look like in the next 10 to 15 years, but who can also kind of decompose that vision into a set of steps, who can think about like, okay, if I have this vision of the future, what is the first thing that I need to build? And what is the next set of hypotheses that I need to test in order to determine the second thing that I need to build? We're looking for people who can recruit. We're looking for people who can tell stories. So really, I think we're looking for kind of exceptional people. Of course, we do have to believe in the product strategy. We do have to believe that the product that they're focused upon today kind of solves a urgent problem or unlocks a meaningful opportunity for the stakeholders that it's designed to serve, and that there is a big enough market into which to sell, such that something can go from zero to hundreds of millions of dollars in ARR within a 10 to 15 year period.
It's interesting you say that because I just, as a technologist, as a fellow technologist, I find that many times technologists fall in love with the technology and they don't understand there's like a real world out there. And technology is a means to an end. It should be solving real problems in the real world, which I see many startups have a problem with, overcoming that barrier.
I think one way that I navigate around this is like, I consider myself like what some people call a thesis-driven investor. So like, I don't actually spend most of my time talking to startups or hearing pitches. I spend most of my time talking to data and ML practitioners as well as other developers to better understand their needs and to really kind of zero in on where I think there's either white space in the market or perhaps components of data and ML stacks that ought to be replaced. And then once I've kind of identified an opportunity, then I'll start to look for either people who I think could build a solution or products that exist that could be the solution. And so in many ways, I think that helps me kind of like weave my way around those that are like just technologies searching for a problem, because I'm starting with a problem and backing out into the technology.
Is the value add you bring to founders? What would they say about you as their board member?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think like as early stage investors, we both need to kind of like understand our swim lane, but also be able to support companies in a wider range of capabilities. So, I will help portfolio companies with everything from like recruiting to like connecting with their early customers to writing marketing and positioning copy. But I think my swim lane is really being able to understand the market, to be able to have kind of this bird's eye view of what is happening in data and ML. Again, because I'm not spending that much time in pitches, I'm spending more time like talking to the practitioners, and to help them kind of navigate decisions that are related to kind of what is happening in the world, either by understanding the competitive forces, understanding what potential customers and or other stakeholders might need, while also kind of aligning closely with their own vision, and ensuring that what they build is something that they believe in.
Everyone's talking about generative AI now. What's your take on where it is all going?
So I'll admit that like having kind of like built an ML team in the 2014 to like maybe 2017 period, and then having seen a lot of the like hype around like conversational interfaces and tools like Alexa, back then, I was initially kind of quite skeptical of all of the hype around generative AI, around like large language models. My skepticism, I think, has been reined in for two reasons. The first is that I really do think that the improvements in the underlying models are exponential. Like the transformer architectures, they work in a way that the previous model architectures did not. So the performance gains, I think, do truly unlock new applications, new opportunities. But I think the thing that is perhaps more intriguing to me, given some of the focus on tools and platforms, has been the democratizing impact of some of these language model APIs. So, back in 2017, 2018, I was just transitioning into venture, and so like company executives would occasionally ask me to kind of like advise them on their AI strategy. And they'd reach out and kind of say like, look, we've accumulated all of this data, like we're trying to figure out like what we should do with it and how to define and implement an AI strategy. And back then, like my answer to most of these companies was like, don't bother unless you really believe that you have this urgent problem that can be solved with AI ML. The investment associated with even just implementing a prototype, even just determining if an AI ML solution is going to solve your problem, it's so high that it's really difficult to justify. A lot of companies tried anyway, and I think like a lot of companies did see that like the ROI associated with their bets on ML was just not very high. But these LM APIs, I think they really changed that. Now, if you have an idea about like a tool, a new feature that you could implement with ML, you can build it in a weekend. You don't hire a 5-person ML team, at least initially. You don't need to think about like, how do you organize your data? How do you implement, a training loop and so on and so forth? You can kind of evaluate these ML-driven ideas very quickly. And then with kind of additional information about, how those features will impact your users, how they'll move the needle with regards to your business strategy, you can determine if you're going to kind of double down on that, if you are going to think about, fine-tuning or training your own models and so on and so forth. And so I think this is really important because it actually, I think it really unlocks the market for ML. Now, like literally any company with a developer can think about experimenting with ML. And, as somebody who invests in ML tools and platforms, like that's really exciting to me.
If and how these large language models will be adopted by enterprises. And what will that look like? What will it require on their side? And what portions of what they do with these models is owned by, the open AIs of the world? What portion will be owned by the enterprises, like built by them? What portion of it will be like owned by startups, open source, which is probably where you will be investing in?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, I think like what I've seen so far is that like the first phase of adoption of LMs and like LM APIs, other tools and platforms has primarily been driven by like an indie hacker community, if you will. It's either kind of like IC developers or people who are starting companies, but we haven't seen that much like mainstream adoption by larger enterprises. We're just beginning to see that. We're just beginning to see even kind of like bigger tech companies, established skunkworks teams that are focused upon exploring applications of LMs and implementing applications of LMs. So like the truest answer that I can give you to that question is like, I don't know. And I think we're going to learn a ton in the next year. That said, it seems like there is a strong sense of urgency among these either like growth stage companies or like recently minted unicorn companies to both like define and implement their LM strategy. So I think we're going to learn a lot. I also think we're going to learn a lot quickly. One of the biggest issues that I see today seems to be associated with managing uncertainty associated with language models and managing uncertainty across various dimensions. So like today, if you were to adopt a new database, like you would have certain guarantees about the database performance. There would be certain SLAs associated with how quickly you can read and write data and things like that. We don't have the same, we don't have like the same rules and policies for LMs, if you will. Querying an LM API, it could take 10 seconds. It could take 10 milliseconds. It's really hard to build applications and to build kind of like more complex systems without those types of like guarantees and SLAs. And so I do see that as kind of one of the primary gaps that needs to be addressed before enterprises can adopt LMs. With regards to who is going to act upon that opportunity or kind of other associated opportunities, for example, with like connecting disparate systems, actually building applications around a model. It's funny, over the past maybe like 5 to 6 years at Amplify, I feel like every time I invest in a startup, people always say like, oh, aren't you worried that, AWS is going to do that? Aren't you worried that, like GCP or like Azure, like the cloud vendors are just going to like occupy all that space? And then you see, like Snowflake, and then you see Datadog, and you see all of these companies building developer tools and enterprise infrastructure that have been able to compete meaningfully with the cloud vendors. And I think, frankly, like we're just going to see the same phenomena in AI. Infrastructure, dev tools, like it's never been a winner takes all market. Now, perhaps some people might say that, like, given the training costs associated with large language models, it's more likely to be a winner takes all market. But frankly, I think even the training costs will be mitigated over time. And I think there's already early evidence, if you look at, companies like Anthropic, Cohere, et cetera, that like this is not going to become a winner takes all market.
AI companies traditionally have struggled, I think, as opposed to other types of like enterprise SaaS, have struggled to switch from like a services model. Some of them have struggled to switch from a services model to a proper product. And part of being a data, you're a data scientist, first, like the first phase is always like hands-on by a data scientist. And the best companies I've seen have done services for a while and then very quickly kind of transition to a product. I wonder how you're thinking about it, and how do you spot the teams that can productize? Is there any advice you give them early on to help them productize?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting. I feel like for a period of time, like investors were like very, very skeptical of like services driven businesses, particularly in the open source. You hear investors telling companies like, don't fall into the services trap. Like, don't just lean on NRE, et cetera. I actually think similar to your implication that like services are a great way to do kind of like user research and product discovery, including to like validate some of your hypotheses about what might be the best product to build. And we're seeing more and more examples of this. So, within the Amplify portfolio, perhaps like the most prominent example is DBT. DBT is now a unicorn company, but it's a company that emerged from Fishtown Analytics, which was an analytics engineering consultancy. I think perhaps what I see is like the most critical thing is maintaining the focus on product as an end goal. I think one of the challenges with services is that cash flow can get addicting. And so if you're optimizing for revenue, if you're optimizing for cash flow, then it's easy to just start saying yes to everybody rather than like, again, using those services to test various product hypotheses. So I've found that, the founders who are most successful in kind of navigating from services to product are those who go into it saying like, our goal is to get to product. Our goal is to get to product as kind of like fast and efficiently as possible. These are some of our product ideas, and we're going to use services to test those product ideas, not as a way to kind of like fund the business until those product ideas magically appear.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest challenges today with the given market dynamics. Boards are pushing founders to get to more revenues, but at the end of the day, they need like sustainable revenues is also a thing. As a fellow female technologist, I'm sure you share many of my experience of being the only female in a room full of techies, and I wonder if you can share any of your experience
literally every woman in venture has an experience where somebody mistook her for, an EA. When I go to, networking events and I tell people like I work in venture capital, typically like the next question that they ask is not like, what do you invest in, but like, what do you do? I do hope with kind of more women going into venture, that will change. I think the thing that is a little bit more nefarious to me is the exclusion. No, as I mentioned earlier, I think like so much of venture capital is like network driven. And, early in my career, I remember, some of my male colleagues would like go golfing on the weekend, or like they would go to like whiskey tastings and things like that. And, I wouldn't be invited. And, it was during those social occasions that they would talk through deals and they would get, intelligence about, what company was raising or what company was spinning out. And so that to me was kind of the biggest challenge that I had to overcome. I think like I needed to find my own ways to generate deal flow, my own ways to source, knowing that I was probably going to be excluded from a lot of those conversations. As such, I think like whenever we host dinners, whenever we host events, like I really, really do try to focus as much as possible on getting more diverse representation, knowing that like I don't want to exclude other people from those conversations, from those opportunities.
Last question, because we have 2 more minutes. Maybe your best advice for founders about fundraising. And I will add that I asked this specifically of you because I've heard of a few founders who love your advice. So
I thought that you were going to say you asked this specifically of me because my advice is probably also like the most controversial advice, but I tend to be consistent in this. There are kind of like 2 sides to this coin. One I'd say is like, don't raise too much. I have generally seen that raising too much capital leads to sloppy execution. I think feeling a little bit resource constrained tends to be better for like both creativity. I think it tends to be better for focus, and just anecdotally, it does seem to lead to better outcomes. The kind of inverse of that is, don't optimize for valuation, optimize for minimizing dilution. And, oftentimes I think like you can minimize dilution by raising what you need rather than raising as much as possible. So this is a controversial opinion. I know there are a lot of people who say that like, given the market dynamics, you should raise, as much as possible when you can. And I will of course admit that like there are exceptions to this rule, but I've seen too many great companies stumble by just raising too much, setting the bar too high, and creating an environment where they don't feel these constraints that force focus.
So I tend to agree. Maybe that's why I asked, because I wanted other people to have the same view as I do. I tend to agree. Thank you so much, Sarah. This was wonderful. I enjoyed it. I'm sure our viewers and listeners will as well. Thank you for your time.
No, it was great joining you. Thank you for asking so many amazing questions.